Hi, this is Annie Grace, and welcome to This Naked Mind podcast. I'm so happy to have you here. And today's guest, I'm really excited to have. This is Andrew Shanahan. He's the founder of Man Be Fat. And Andrew just reached out to me a few months ago with his own journey, which he's going to share today. So I'm so excited. Thanks, Andrew, for joining.
You're more than welcome. Thank you very much. And thank you for This Naked Mind. This is going to sound like a blatant commercial. You're going to have people saying that you just paid me to appear. But yeah. This Naked Mind has been a massive part of me stopping drinking. So thank you.
Oh, that's brilliant. So why don't we start with that? Why don't you back up and kind of go back to the first drink, the early days, and just sort of tell us your story.
My story is relatively normal, I would say, for a British UK background, in that we all start, or certainly in the area that I'm from, we start drinking relatively early. So I was probably about 13 when I first started drinking, and it was really just a case of our school was, it had a culture of drinking at weekends, and the era that I grew up in was not a particularly enlightened era, I don't think, in the kind of the late 80s, early 90s, when I became a teenager, where there were a lot of publications at the time that were very, very pro heavy drinking and pro binge drinking. And you look back at them now, and even, a couple of decades on, they just seem absurdly promotional for that way of life. And I think that, but I just grew up, with that as the norm around me. And so I didn't think it was really anything to be concerned about. I didn't think it was anything unusual. And so for me, weekends would be drinking heavily, and then during the week I didn't really particularly drink a huge amount, but it was definitely that sense of when you went out to drink, you drank heavily to the point that you were sick or just drunk and out of control. And
it was you and all your friends, and just seemed the thing to do. Totally.
I mean, that's why it feels, when everyone is doing something, that there are very few detractors, and you don't really see a different way to things, because everyone had that sort of experience. So when you turned 18, you were bought a pint glass, and half of it was filled up with spirits from the top shelves, and half of it, and then it was filled up with lager, and you downed that. And that was sort of, you can see it as a rite of initiation now, but that was very much, everyone had that. That was just the thing. That was what you did. It was, and it seems absurd, as I say, to look back and think that was the way that we approached drinking. But I think for me, the important thing about those early years was that it set in my mind the pattern that there was no moderation. So people often talk about drinking and say, can't you just enjoy a nice glass of red wine or something? But that was never really something that I learned how to do, or something that I was really I was introduced to. It was always the drinking that I was introduced to was getting smashed.
Wow, that's crazy. And there was a guy recently, it was probably a year ago, and he had written me a story about how he had stopped drinking, and his uncle actually called him up very upset and said, "Son, you have a body, punish it." And he was just like, wow, this is a typical thing to say.
Yeah, and that's those sorts of, those indicators and those pushes towards heavy consumption were everywhere. And so that there was some famous magazines in the UK called FHM and Loaded. They were basically pamphlets glorifying binge drinking, and that was sort of what I grew up with. And so, as I say, it just wasn't in any way that sense. I think that the regret that I have around drinking is that I never did experience that sort of that nice glass of wine with dinner experience. It was always, if you had a nice glass of wine, you'd finish the bottle, and then if you finished the bottle, you'd start thinking, and it wasn't, it was just a consequence of that social the mores of the time, really.
Yeah, I do remember like finishing a bottle and then being like, okay, well, if I switch to beer, I can keep going. So I can have a few beers after a bottle of wine. But if I keep going with this, and definitely it was almost strategic, like how to drink as much as possible and minimize how bad you were going to feel, or make your best effort not to get sick later, which I got really good at. I only got sick like a handful of times, but it's just so crazy in hindsight. So what about your parents? Like where were they doing? Like what was their point of view?
So I'm estranged from my father, so I don't really know what his approach was. But my mum and my grandma, who brought me up, they probably had a much better relationship with alcohol in many ways. I think they did come from a time when moderation and alcohol, they came from an era of privation in some ways, where my grandma lived through rationing, and they both grew up my mum grew up in an era when alcohol was sparse, really. And I think that I think contributed to them being much more adult and mature, and being able to enjoy alcohol in that way. Whereas for me, but then there was definitely still that sense of the weekend was when you got drunk a little bit, or you cared less about the units that you should be drinking at weekend.
And so were you drinking with your family then?
No, not really. I don't think. Not no.
But they were kind of doing it. You're kind of doing it, but it's just the thing everybody's doing.
Yeah, I mean, I would be out with friends, and my mum would be out with her friends, and it was just that was the way that we approached it, really.
That's interesting. So you turn 18. That drink, I've not heard of that before. I'm sure it's like just common practice, but that sounds like it tasted awful.
I mean, fortunately, and probably life-savingly for a huge number of the people who did it, they were just instantly sick, because you can only imagine just how appalling it must be to metabolize that and have the body process so much alcohol in such a concentrated form. But yeah, it's truly gross.
And so then after that, did you go to university, or where did your path take you?
Yeah, I did. And I mean, this is where sort of at university, my kind of naivety around food and drink and things was really came into play, because I just, drank as much as I'd have drunk on the weekend, but probably 3 or 4 times a week. And so, my weight ballooned massively. I didn't know how to cook, I'm embarrassed to say, literally nothing. I could probably make pasta in a pan and then empty a tin of tuna on the top of it, and that's what I would consider cooking. But most of the time it was just takeout food. And then lots and lots of lager on top of that. And it was really, I look back on that period of my life, and I'm ashamed about how I wasted that opportunity to learn at university, really. I mean, I did well, but then I absolutely did not suck the marrow from that experience. It was really just, I phoned it in massively. And that's a shame. I look back on that and think there was 3 years there where I really had an opportunity to go and learn from some really fascinating people. And I just slept through most of it.
Yeah, and it's amazing how you can do well and not learn anything. I felt exactly the same about my college experience. Like those two things are not mutually, they are mutually exclusive.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was because I always read an awful lot outside of the course material that I was able to still get by in essays, even if I hadn't necessarily read the source text, because I could bring in lots of other things that I was sort of just reading through interest of my own. And that's how I survived that. But I mean, what an idiot I was. Probably still am, but
So then where did that take you after uni?
So I did a drama degree, and I went to university. As I said, I was relatively lazy, and I went to a university where I thought I was going to learn to be an actor. And I didn't realize that it was more of an academic course, studying plays, studying drama. And so I was sort of a little bit wrong-footed by that, I think. But the way I got around it was the fact that there were also a lot of courses on writing. So I really sort of discovered and saw that I enjoyed writing an awful lot more. And so I went from there and graduated and I studied journalism and went and worked for a magazine publisher and wrote. And after working there for a bit, I'd sort of qualified as a journalist, and I'd worked as a journalist for them and learned a lot about writing and the art of writing, and started getting pulled more into management roles, and just realized that actually what I was far more interested in was the writing itself. So I went freelance and went and wrote for a lot of the UK national newspapers. So I wrote for The Guardian and The Times, and wrote for a lot of the magazines, including some of the ones that championed all the heavy drinking as well. So things came full circle there.
Yeah, it's interesting. So Catherine Gray, she wrote The Unexpected Joy of Being Sober, and she and I have become friends. And she came from that industry as well, writing and freelance and writing for, and she said it was just such a boozy culture, which I don't know what culture isn't these days, but she said specifically that culture was.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think short of probably, working as a stockbroker in the city, I think journalists is the one where no one really looks at you askance if you're coming back from lunch having had 3 or 4 pints, because sometimes you need to do that in the course of writing, and there's that sort of that weird myth that persists about the fact that somehow writing can access your creative powers, whereas I don't know about you, but were you worried about that at all when you stopped drinking, or were you not writing particularly before you stopped drinking?
So it was funny because being a writer was one of those things that I put on the shelf, and I always thought like, okay, I want to be a novelist. Like I want to write stories about, or memoir or something along those lines. Certainly not a book about overcoming drinking. And so somebody had told me early on, in order to be a writer, you just have to write every day. So I was always kind of a big journal. Like I kept a lot of journals until I started drinking heavily all the time. And then those just fell off. Like I have stacks and stacks of journals. And then I have the years from like that, probably it was about 13, 14 years of really heavy drinking that like, I maybe have 1 or 2. Like if something really good or bad, I would write a half a page or something like that. And then as soon as I was starting to look at my drinking, that started back up. And now I have like stacks and stacks just in the last 4 or 5 years again. And so it's really interesting. I found that, but I did have that, although that evidence was there, I had that very clear misconception that I would be a writer on my laptop with a glass of wine someday, somewhere. Like that was my thought. Like that's what I was going to do.
Well, I was even more
ironically,
because I used to think that if I stopped drinking, that would sort of somehow rob me, like reverse kryptonite, that I wouldn't be able to write if I didn't drink. And it wasn't that I was, drinking every day to sort of be able to write. It's just that I think it's one of the things that allowed me to see alcohol as an addictive substance the same way that tobacco is and nicotine is, that, I think from the voice of addiction, or the addiction itself, had given me these pathways and these ideas that somehow I wouldn't be able to function without these points where I was drinking, or when I was a smoker, that exactly the same thing, that somehow I wouldn't be able to, well, how do you go out if you're not going to have a cigarette? How do you speak to people if you're not having a cigarette? And obviously it's absurd, it's patently absurd. But then I think that it's only until you've lived through that period after that voice of addiction quietens down, and you start to think, well, yeah, of course you can do things. But I think in a funny way, I think that's where, people have spoken quite a lot about this 100-day point around not drinking. And the first bit being this real enthusiasm and this just, this freedom that comes on you. And then there's that sort of that tunnel period where you go through this sort of thinking of, really challenging yourself. And I think that's the voice of the addiction dying out in some ways. I'm assuming, and for me, that's really changed post 100 days, really.
Yeah. I think 100 days is a really pivotal time. I actually developed like a program. It's like 100 days of lasting change, and every day for 100 days, it's like a video and an email, because like those days are so critical. And it's just like getting through that first part, because you cycle through I mean, the first 30 days are basically like almost euphoric in some ways when you have the mindset shift before you stop and you're just kind of on this high, but then you're getting back into real life and you actually experience all sorts of emotions. And then I would even say the first year being a really kind of pivotal time. And I feel a lot of people at the end of the first year sort of say, well, is that it? Like, I kind of had these, because they're like, well, you get your baseline of being like up and down here, all of a sudden your baseline is way up here. That jump initially feels really powerful and profound, but then you're living up here and you don't remember being down here anymore. You cannot, like, you can't physically remember how it felt to feel hungover. You cannot have that memory because it's a physical thing. And so all of a sudden you're up here and you're like, well, life's good, but when you were down here, you weren't saying, but life's good. And so it's this funny thing that the brain does where you adapt to your new normal in a sense that you think, well, is that it? And then you have to like say, well, wait a second, like let's take a moment to remember this and then realize, yeah, this is it.
There's an interesting analogy to that experience of when you have children, in that there's that real the euphoric feeling of, wow, this has just happened and this is the most primal amazing thing that's just gone on and that I've experienced. And obviously there's the oxytocin, the drug that's kind of floods through your system when you've got your new babies. But then you sort of enter this foggy period where it's just this sort of tiredness, and you're, from an identity point of view, you're really readjusting to, okay, well, who am I now? I'm now a dad. I'm now a provider. I have these sort of slightly different, and obviously you're still really, really happy, but there is a huge shift in identity. And I think I felt that it's analogous in a little bit to stopping drinking, that sort of initial burst of real joy. And then this renegotiation of identity that goes on through that period. And it's really fascinating. And I think that for me, the really useful training that I had for stopping drinking was stopping smoking, because the key thing to say to those people as they sort of come up to that 100-day period, or as they go through that miasma of identity and questioning, is that it all clears up. Same with the children as well, that you do renegotiate who you are and how you feel, and you do come to new understandings, and it does work out. And I think the message to people in that period, although I haven't I wouldn't count myself as an expert in any way, shape or form, but the message I think that I would take from my own experience is that don't worry too much, don't question that period. Know from an outsider's point of view that those questions do get answered in time, and that actually it's really just a case of waiting, of working through those questions, but not thinking that you have to have an answer immediately, because an answer does come.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, I think through that, really, really just keeping it in perspective that, all right, what is this fermented drink, actually gonna solve here? Like, if there's some existential questions you're having, certainly going back to that hole you found yourself in is not going to be the solution. And sometimes our brain, the addicted part of our brain, I think, can play tricks on us with that and say, oh, well, you start to remember things through rose-colored glasses, and you're like, well, I used to connect with people so much more. I used to have a social life. I used to this, I used to that. And it was like, okay, those things actually didn't come from the glass. So, how do you?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, so where did you sort of find yourself when you're like, okay, now I need to make a change? And was it intentional, or was it sort of accidental, or?
No, I think it was more a progression, really. I think, like a lot of people, through kind of my 20s and early 30s, I could physically just about sustain the drinking that I was doing. But as I progressed into my 30s, I just found that hangovers were less a sort of, a 24-hour headache and something that you take some paracetamol and you're fine. And they were more like full-blown mental health emergencies every time I was drinking, where I just found that, my levels of anxiety were crazy high, and I was just feeling very displaced as a person, and that it was deeply unpleasant. And I suppose having young children as well, I was just so aware of how low energy I was when, you know, I was hungover. And so I would constantly be in this cycle of feeling bad about the fact that I was drinking, and also a little bit of trepidation when I was drinking, because I was starting to think, oh grief, you know, I'm going to be hungover tomorrow, and knowing what that entailed, and just not really looking forward to it. So I was going into drinking with this sort of, you know, non-positive mindset, and feeling like, and so you have one drink and you're already thinking, oh gosh, I know where this ends up. And you sort of, clearly the joy had gone from any illusion of joy, really, because, you know, as I think you make the point in the book really, really well, that clearly joy exists outside of drinking. Because look at children, they are the ones who own joy. They are walking, talking joy. They can do happiness really, really well, and very, very few of those children are drunk. I would wager, is my guess. So I think that really is the key to it, is just trusting that you will recalibrate your own ability to find joy in things. And so, yeah, so for me, in my 30s, I'm a Christian, and I would often stop drinking for Lent, because I was really, I just wanted to stop drinking. And so I would use that as my, oh, right, okay, I'll give up drinking. But, you know, and I would do dry January and Stoptober and those short-term initiatives. But, you know, I think you have pinpointed very well in This Naked Mind about the fact that that's not a good introduction to not drinking, because clearly you white knuckle it. You are doing it from the perspective of someone who is, you know, being deprived, and that is just, it's the wrong way to start with these things. And I think, you know, you acknowledge the work that Alan Carr had done in The Easy Way to Stop Smoking. Sorry, planes going overhead. So, and I think that one of the key messages in both books really is that if you go into something feeling like you are quitting, you are being forced to quit something, or you are giving something up, then you're doomed almost from the start. And it's really about having that perspective of, actually, you are going to gain so much. And I think I was much more aware of that with smoking, because I could see very quickly about how I felt able to breathe, able to run, able to exercise more. And I think it's a slightly more subtle change with drinking. I think it's as profound. I think it's arguably more profound an impact, but I think it's slightly more subtle. It's not the fact that you're suddenly leaping up flights of stairs and going, gosh, I'm not even out of breath. I think that the physical changes manifest over a longer period of time. But they absolutely do manifest. And, you know, there's no question about that in my mind. And really, so I just went into my 30s, and I was in this cycle of not really enjoying drinking, of giving up any opportunity I could, giving up for Lent. I gave up for Lent again this year. And as I'd given up, I was thinking, you know, that I wasn't particularly enjoying the idea of going back into drinking. And someone recommended your book, which I read and thought was profoundly brilliant. And I think you should be carried through the streets on people's shoulders on a regular basis. Does that happen often?
Yeah, thank you. You're making me blush. That's very funny. That's so cool. So a few things, like the physical changes, I think you're absolutely right. Like, it's not almost an overnight thing, but after a few weeks or even a month or something, I think the main things is people, I think, come up to you and say, like, what are you doing? Like, it isn't as much a specific thing. It's almost like wait, what's happening with you? And so I think really it's in the skin, in the eyes, and almost the aura, if you will, like the energy you bring it just shifts and it just changes. And now I feel like sometimes I can, not sometimes, I can almost all the time pinpoint somebody who's drinking heavily and somebody who doesn't drink, because they look different in their eyes. Like the presence, you know, the aura, the sense of like assuredness and joy, living without regrets, or the sense of like, I mean, in the skin, you can see, you know, kind of veins and redness and around the eyes and bags below the eyes. And so it's almost like this crazy beauty serum that you didn't even realize that was going to happen. And so I started looking at pictures of myself and I was like, I look better in my mid-30s than I ever did in my 20s. Like, what is happening, you know? And I was like, oh my gosh, it's the drinking. So I just thought that was worth saying, because it's so interesting.
To be fair, my default facial status is bags and red eyes and broken veins, so I've got nothing really. I'm already down there. But yeah, I think, you know, for me, I think the most profound physical change, and myself and my wife. So just to add this onto the story, so when I read the book, I sort of instantly knew. I think, you know, you make the point in the book that you can drink while you're reading the book. And I just absolutely didn't want to, and never, you know, it does feel there is that sort of same semblance of hypnotic suggestion through the book, which I think is part of its magic. Is just that I just had absolutely no desire to drink whatsoever. And really, I mean, looking back at it now, clearly it was because it was just firing down all of the arguments that I would make to myself about drinking and why I persisted drinking when I wasn't particularly enjoying it. And of course, the really lunatic thing is that as you read it, you realize that no one actually particularly enjoys drinking, even those people who go, oh, I just have a glass of wine on the weekend. It's like, well, you know, that's great, but do you enjoy it? You know, is that something that adds to your life? Or is it something that you choose to do? Or is it something that you've just built into an addiction over the years? Obviously, they're very difficult conversations to have, and I don't tend to try and have them really. But so my wife, I said, you've got to read this book. It's just, it nails it. And I'd always thought that she had the perfect relationship with alcohol, because she would have a Guinness, like a pint of Guinness, and then she would move on to tea. And she would always seemingly enjoy the ones that she had. But speaking to her now, she was like, no, I didn't particularly enjoy them. It was just, you know, everyone else was doing it, so I did it. And she would say, you know, that actually one Guinness would sometimes be 2 or 2.5, and for her that was enough to, you know, make her feel a bit rubbish the next day. And so she read it and she was like, yeah, okay, fair enough, the jig is up. And so she stopped about, as I never failed to remind her that she stopped about a week later than I did. So I often tell her about the things that are going to come up in the week, that greater experience that I have.
That's hilarious. That's like my husband and I. He never fails to remind me that.
Sorry.
I was just saying, that's like my husband. He never fails to remind me that he's a year younger than me. So.
Surely that means you've got the experience and the wisdom, though, Annie.
That's right. I know. I'm gonna take your tack and start being like, so I'd like to tell you about what happens in your, you know, 39th year, your 40th. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So for me, I think the most profound physical change that I've experienced has been a calmness that wasn't there before, because, you know, addiction works through creating an itch, doesn't it? It's the itch that self-generates. And so that, for me, removing that from my weekly experience and my life has led to, I think, a greater degree of calm. And for me, you know, my work is around physical health, but I think it's oh so apparent how interconnected mental health and physical health are. I don't think that's anything new for anyone, but, you know, for me, that really has shown me just how powerful and how valuable our mental health is, because I've just been so much more, I don't like the word present. It feels far too American for me, but I'll use the word present.
It's interesting because we spend So the real joy, and that is not even the right word, but the real, feeling that is very positive around drinking is the anticipation, because you're anticipating that you're going to scratch that itch. It's right before you have that first drink, or for the first 20 minutes after you have that first drink. And it's like, that's the thing, right? And if you think, okay, in my day, that's, maybe an hour before, 20 minutes after, it's an hour and 20 minutes or something, that I have that kind of anticipation. I'm about to scratch this itch. I'm going to be able to, do the thing that's going to make all this last 23 hours feel better. But then this, presence, this calmness, this feeling of like, wow, I can live my life and I don't have any noise in my head. I don't have that itch. I don't have that itch that I can't scratch. Because living with an itch you're not able to scratch, by the way, during the day, you're at work first thing in the morning. It's not really a good idea to like drink a few shots, like all of this time during the day that you have this, something's just missing. I'm just not comfortable in my own skin. That's 90% of your day. And then all of a sudden you're living this life where 90% of your day, that is gone. That noise is gone. That's silenced. And you're just like here. And it's just like, whoa. And I think that's, people are like, well, how do you get so excited about it? Like, how do you get so happy about, and I'm like, that's why, because all of the sudden life has just taken on this, like, now I'm focused on all sorts of other things that, like, by the way, life has lots of cool shit in it. Sorry to say, but like, it just does, like, it's a good thing. And so all of a sudden I can see it all. Whereas before it was just like, a lot of my thinking was about like, okay, how soon is too soon,
Yeah. No, I
pop the bottle.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that it's really evident to me now. So we go down to Devon on holiday, which is sort of a coastal county in Britain, and it's a beautiful county. And but it's funny, going down there after we'd stopped drinking, we were sort of going down, and there were all these different places that we used to go to for dinner and things, and that was part of our experience of a traditional family holiday there. And we were just really aware that so much of it was geared up towards when and where we could start drinking. And we were thinking, gosh, well, what does that do to the holiday? Does it ruin the holiday? Because we, so much of our experience has been, but we love going to the Thatch for beer and nachos or whatever. And it's not at all. I think that's where it goes back to this renegotiation of identity that you go through. Because we were thinking, but actually what we love about going to Devon is that we can go to the beach with the kids. We can surf and we can play, and we have time as a family to, play board games and just hang out and go for walks and all of those sorts of things. And then you realize that actually you're right, that there is joy extant in life normally that doesn't have to be wrapped up by or topped off with alcohol, or indeed fueled by, because you can't have a beer as you're surfing. You can't, it's not you enjoy surfing, and then you kid yourself that you need to finish off the perfect day, you need to have a bottle of wine and 5 pints of beer. You don't, because that then means that the next day isn't perfect. You can have this series of great things that, if you just stop the lunacy or the brainwashing, and it is brainwashing, of thinking that you need alcohol.
Yeah, absolutely. So interesting. So I want to say one quick thing on Stoptober and all those sorts of things, something we talked about just before we started recording. But and I have to say it because yesterday my new book, The Alcohol Experiment, came out, and that was exactly why I wrote it. Was basically that I'd see so many people who had done so many 30-day breaks, 30-day breaks, 30-day breaks, and it was all kind of white knuckling. And then all of a sudden there they were, the end of 30 days, day 31, it's like, oh, thank goodness. And alcohol had actually become more important during those 30 days than it was before. And so anyway, the alcohol experiment is meant to just flip that on its head. So this naked mind, I say, don't stop drinking at the beginning. Let me give you this mindset shift. But the alcohol experiment is for people who just want to stop drinking. So anyway, it's available. It's out there. I'm super excited about it. And I think that it really addresses those fundamental issues and all those breaks that every one of us who's questioning our drinking does. I mean, maybe not a huge majority. Like, we just take those breaks, and then I did it every time I was pregnant. And then I proved to myself, oh, well, I don't have a problem because I just spent 9 months not drinking. Sweet. Go back to it. And by the way, I made it more important that whole 9 months because I sat there and felt sorry for myself at every social event. So such a tangled web. So, but Andrew, tell me, you were a writer and now you were Man v Fat. Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, so for the benefit of everyone who won't have heard of what I do, I run an organisation called Man v Fat, and you can have a look at manvfat.com. And what we do is that we support men around the world who want to lose weight. And the reason that it exists is because I went through a journey with my weight. So previously I was running a business that was supporting men who were getting married. So we run a website called I Am Staggered, and it was all about men, best men, fathers of the bride, grooms. And so I wrote a lot about wedding speeches. I wrote a lot of wedding speeches, advising guys about honeymoons and things like that. And the business, I'd run it for about 3-4 years. It was quite a big business, and I got just bored of it really and wanted a new challenge. And so I sold that business. And part of the issue about that was that I was working as a freelancer at the same time. So that was one of the strings to my bow. And one of the other ones was the fact that I was writing for a lot of publications about food and drink. So I wrote for The Guardian, big UK newspaper, and about food. So I reviewed restaurants for them. I won an award for being a restaurant writer and things like that. And so I spent a lot of my time either working, building up this business, and I was working ridiculous sort of 13-14 hour days, and getting home and just sort of needing to speed relax really. So I was, drinking 4 beers and then eating a pack of crisps, and just because I wasn't really moving a lot during the day, and I was stressed essentially. And the other side of it as well is that a lot of the work I was doing was being paid to go and eat at nice restaurants. And I was not a fool. I said yes every time someone asked if I would go and eat somewhere, and they would pay me to do it. So, and I did a lot of reviewing for different guides and things like that. And it was a great job. I really enjoyed doing it. But I became incredibly fat as a result of doing that, both being stressed with the business and writing about food. And so I was sort of previously about 18 stone, which I can never convert into pounds. So it's 14 pounds in a stone. So what's that? And could not carry that weight well. And so I was very, very big and just miserable with it. And when I sort of sold the business, it left me with a bit of time available. And so I started focusing on my health. And I started trying to find a bit of support to lose weight. So I went to my doctor, and he was awful, doing very, very little information, and they don't sort of see it really as their problem, although they are increasingly seeing it as their problem, to support people with their weight because of how many things it impacts on. And then I joined some of the big weight loss organizations, which were really difficult because obviously they are exclusively for women, although they don't actually tell you that. So I was the one bloke in the meeting, and it was really an alien sort of feeling, because they were talking about, they had challenges about let's see who can get into their little black dress and things for Christmas. And I was thinking, I don't really want to get into a little black dress at Christmas. And so it really was jarring. And also a lot of the things that I was struggling with were things that they don't really address. So for example, for men, it's seen as a really positive thing to have a big appetite, to go back for thirds and fourths and fifths and sixths. That's constructed as a very positive thing from a male point of view. And they don't talk about that at Weight Watchers or Slimming World, because that's it's just not the way that it's not the people that they deal with. Because for women, a personal trainer once explained it to me that women would much rather decrease the amount of calories they intake so that they can work out less. Men would rather increase the amount that they work out so they can eat more. And I think that's there's a fairly profound difference between men and women with regard to weight there. And so it just sort of went on from there. And I was just stunned that there was no support out there for men who wanted to lose weight. You know, there's lots of support out there for men who want to get fit and, you know, be able to do 100 chin-ups, but nothing really for men who want to lose weight. And so I did a crowdfunding campaign to support Man Be Fat. And we had, by the end of about 2 weeks, it was overfunded. We had 3,000 or 4,000 guys who'd signed up for it. And, you know, the crowdfunding campaign was absolutely rubbish, because I'd never done a crowdfunding campaign before, but it was just, I didn't really know what it was that we were trying to start, other than, I mean, I would not say a movement, because that sounds far too arrogant, but it felt like, you know, there should be something there to support men, and currently there isn't. What can we do? So we started this, and Man Be Fat grew from there. And now, so we started a website, we started a forum, we started a number of schemes. So we run a very popular scheme in the UK called Man V Fat Football, and that's where their soccer leagues, I'll translate it into American for you, that's soccer. And so they're soccer leagues just for men who are overweight and obese, and we support them with resources to lose weight and to know how to lose weight. But also we support them, so before they play their game each week, they all weigh in, and as part of the game they can score bonus goals for their weight loss as well. So it means that the whole team is actually engaged in weight loss, and it's been very, very successful. And we've now got over 10,000 guys in the UK who are losing weight with us, and we've lost, I think players have lost over £120,000 in weight since we began. And we've just launched in Australia. So our first league is launched in Australia, and we're bringing it to America next year. So it's been, you know, that was my sort of background. Alongside that, you know, obviously I was drinking, and drinking was just part of my life. And I think that it's been interesting seeing how much I built drinking into working. And I think you touch on this a lot in the book, about the fact that, you know, whenever we met up for meetings and things, it would always previously be in a pub. I think it's been a bit of a culture shift for the organisation as a whole, that because I'm not drinking, I don't set up meetings in pubs really anymore. So we've been doing a lot more walking meetings and things like that. So yeah, it's had an impact, I would say, on my work. And also clearly from the point of view of men who are wanting to lose weight and the support that they want, often alcohol is one of the main contributors to their weight in the first place. And so it's been really interesting to go through that personally and see how that's impacted on me. And also to be able to potentially support them with losing weight. And I think the alcohol experiment just sounds like an incredible tool to be able to offer people, because I think you're right. I think that a lot of the existing stopping programs are seen as being a bit of a penance in many ways. Whereas I think a lot of guys, if they can have that positive experience of stopping, you know, a pause to reflect rather than a sort of a stop to grit your teeth through, I think that they would really see the benefit and see they can renegotiate their own relationship with alcohol and see if they're comfortable and to choose it. You know, I think that's the whole point, isn't it? Is that what you want to give people, from my understanding of it, is a completely neutral starting point. Okay, go and choose your relationship with alcohol. Don't be influenced by alcohol, but go and choose what you, don't be influenced by culture as well, and don't be influenced by other people, but just go and choose. And in my experience and my thinking, I think very, very few people would choose probably the existing relationship they have with alcohol. I think most of them would either stop or massively cut down.
Yep, that's so true. Wow, that's such a cool journey. I love that. It's amazing. It's 252 pounds. I got out my calculator.
252 kilograms. What?
252 pounds.
Oh no, sorry, it's 120,000 pounds.
Oh no, it's the like your weight.
Oh, 250.
You lost.
Okay. So I was 252 pounds. And now I'm probably about 60 or 70 pounds lighter than that.
That's cool. That's awesome. Yeah, 250 is big. That's like a 6'4" linebacker.
Yeah, it would have been fine if I was 6'4". I would have grown.
So let me finish up with kind of the last question that I always ask everybody. And so what would you, if you were going to go back in time and talk to Andrew of a few years ago, who was kind of feeling like, okay, alcohol is really important for my writing. I don't know how I would write without it. I don't know how I'd be creative without it. This is part of my identity, about kind of what life's like now, and kind of have a chat with him, what would you say?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I would have just passed me a copy of your book, because I don't think that I could have summed up as pithily and as eloquently and as successfully the impact that that had on me. I think that, you know, it's with the greatest of respect, it's not a long book, so it's not something that is particularly arduous to read, and I think it's so impactful that I think that I would have just probably pinned myself down and read it to me. And I think the real surprise that I would have communicated is just that it hasn't been a sense of loss around alcohol. And actually, in truth, you know, we don't really, I would love to say that I think we acknowledged the fact that it was 100 days, but it was only because I put it in my calendar when I stopped drinking. It's not something that we go day to day, week to week, month to month on saying, wow, it's been 7 months now, it's been 8 months. It's really just a case of that was a decision that was made, and I've never actually really questioned it. I don't know, do you find this a lot with people you speak to about it, that I don't ever really second guess the decision that I made? It's so emphatically the right decision. In fact, the only thing that's surprised me is how, not anti, but how averse I am to alcohol now. So,
Yeah.
you know, if someone accidentally put a gin in a tonic, I would be furious. I would probably make myself sick, because I don't like the idea of it at all. And that's a really profound shift for me. That I just, you know, we were in a pub and there was some beer on the table and I got it on my hand and I was like, that's gross. I just don't, you know, not only because it was gross anyway, but like, it was just, I didn't like having beer on me. And that's
how much it smells. It has such a you don't realize it when you're drinking it, but oh my gosh, you can walk in a room and just smell it. You're like, oh, wow, hits you.
Were you the same, or is there any points where you sort of think, because, you know, like smokers sometimes go, oh, it was just that one cigarette that I always used to, you know, first one on holiday or something that I always used to enjoy, and they look back on and they seem to punish themselves with. Do you have any of those sorts of moments around drinking?
I don't. And it's really interesting because certain people do. So I've been, you know, a few years into this now of getting people's stories, and I've been really giving a lot of thought to like, what is the difference? Because for some people it's like a switch. It's like, I'm never looking back, and why would I? And that was just like nothing. And for other people, they really continue to mourn it and struggle and stuff. And so I've kind of come up with this weird, they stop, or they have a struggle stopping, or they stop and they mourn it. So I've kind of come up with this framework or theory, and obviously it's not going to apply to everyone, and I'll test it out on you because it's very new material in my head, but basically that there's really 3 different layers to the onion, if you will. So there's the outer layer of substance-related beliefs, which my book tackles. It tastes good. It's, you know, going to relax you. These are the things the substance says it does for you. It enhances your experience. It's fun. So you can clean those out. And if that's why you were drinking, if you were drinking for those reasons, like done, full stop, like, okay, it's just not true. Like there's no possible way I like to say how I would not pick up a pint of motor oil and drink it, because like, there's just no way I would put ethanol in my, like, no, right? But then there's a secondary layer of societal beliefs. And if you are very heavily swayed by society, you're in a society. So my cousin, she stopped drinking. She read the book. She's like, oh my gosh, it's amazing. Totally stopped. And then she went back to work, where she works for a woman who owns a vineyard as her second job, and where everything in her work, like she felt like she was in danger of losing some of her job. So now she just drinks at work events and not at home, because that's a balance she felt she had to strike. But you know how insidious that is. And so, but there's a society thing, like it's not a wedding without the champagne toast. It's tied up with reward. It's tied up with celebration. And so if you're drinking for those societal reasons, as well as the substance reasons, it's much harder. But then there's this core, if you will, and these are the reasons for self. And if you are drinking because you don't feel strong enough to be a mom without your 3 glasses of wine, or because you don't have enough confidence to walk into a room and network without that added liquid courage, or if you have beliefs about yourself that are very deep and that you're numbing or covering, or you've tricked yourself into believing that somehow alcohol is fixing a hole that you believe exists within you, that is when people really need to look at that stuff before they become completely free. So I would say, looking at you, that was not the case for you. And for me, that was, I was not drinking. I felt like I have my faith. I felt like a whole happy human. I had just really been duped into this society and this substance sort of category of reasons. And so, but when someone comes and they're drinking for this deep personal need, and they've decided that alcohol can fill that hole, and they haven't filled it with a spiritual practice, or they haven't filled it with a self-love or whatever, then that's where it really struggles. And that's actually where I'm taking some I'm doing a live event in October, and I'm really digging into those things, because people who are going to fly across the world, we have people coming from Australia, Finland, New Zealand, like people are going to come to that, that's where we need to focus, is on those inner reasons. And so anyway, that was a very long-winded answer to your very simple question.
Well, I think very long-winded answers, so touche. I think that's a really interesting framework, and I think that there is a lot to be said for that. I think that it's really interesting, the comparison that you can make between weight loss and alcohol, because clearly, there is a lot of similarities between the guys that we work with, have often fit into those 3 categories. And as crazy as it seems, because, well, I suppose, food isn't an addictive substance, the feeling that people can self-administer through excess amounts of food is an addictive process. So you can, binge and make yourself temporarily feel good, and that then obviously has impacts on weight. And I think that there's a lot of comparisons there around drinking and overeating, and the guys who we work with, and the difficulty in many cases of when someone is using food, and using is the right word there, it's when they are using food to fill a hole, then that is really that's the hardest layer of the onion to access and to support them with. And I think you're right. I think for me, definitely faith has been, I think that and clearly that's all personal, and it's it's to each their own. I think that for me, being able to pray and to be aware of God and what God wants, or what I believe God wants, I think that is fundamental for me in not replacing alcohol, but actually in seeing what alcohol was obscuring from me in many ways.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Yeah, and so I think I would just like to reiterate the thanks that I have for you, and that my wife indeed asked me to pass on to you as well. That I think it's a really, really important, powerful book, and I would hugely recommend it to anyone, and have several times.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew.
And I would lend my copy out to other people, but it's on Kindle, and I'm not lending my Kindle to anyone else.
Very cool. Well, I really appreciate your time. This has just been a really enjoyable way to spend an hour. So thank you so much. And have a wonderful day.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
This has been Annie Grace with This Naked Mind podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You can learn more at thisnakedmind.com. And please remember to rate, review, and subscribe, as it really helps us spread the word.